Well, welcome. My name is Matthew Schmaltz, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Catholicism. And we're here to talk about neoliberalism and Catholicism. And I'd first like to introduce our two guests alphabetically. Matthew Eggemeier is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross. He does research in U.S. political theology and is currently working on a book that examines Thomas Merton's constructive engagement with critical theory. He teaches courses in liberation theology, political theology, and Catholic spirituality. Then I'd also like to introduce Peter Joseph Fritz, who is also a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross. He teaches courses on Catholic theology, the history of Christianity from the 15th century to the present, theology and visual art, and Catholic social thought and capitalism. His main area of research interests are the theology of 20th century German Jesuit Karl Rahner, theological and philosophical aesthetics, and critical discourses on capitalism, especially neoliberalism. So welcome. In the interest of full disclosure, we three of us know each other very well. So please don't misinterpret informality for disrespect. And it's really great to talk with you both about the work you've done in relation to Catholicism and neoliberalism. So first, I'll ask you, Matt, to define neoliberalism.
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt, and thank you for having us. We're really excited about this conversation. One of the challenges in defining neoliberalism is that, at least in popular public discourse on social media and whatnot, it's often used as a kind of political weapon by those on the left to critique and dismiss centrists or moderates or conservatives. So you'll find on Twitter or X, whatever it is, people saying, that's a neoliberal statement. And that's kind of like a mic drop kind of critique in which it's the end of the conversation because you've been labeled in this way. So Peter and I, in writing this book, wanted to try to really kind of define it a bit more precisely. And what we came up with was neoliberalism is a mutation of capitalism that tries to disseminate and proliferate markets into every sphere of existence, every nook and cranny, not just the economic realm, but every realm of life. And furthermore, it proposes that markets are uniquely able to resolve and solve the social problems that we ultimately face. So it's interesting, within the political realm, you don't have kind of laissez-faire capitalism in which the state is kind of hands off and the market operates according to its own logic and own devices. Instead, within neoliberalism, what's demanded is a strong interventionist state that ultimately opens up markets, sustains markets, and protects markets from external incursions. And those incursions would come in the form of regulations, schemes of redistributing the wealth that's created by markets, and so on and so forth. And so also we have a situation in which it trickles down, it seems to me, into everyday existence, into personal life, into our common sense. And so I think we feel this in academia, that we're called to be kind of entrepreneurs of ourselves at this point, constantly marketing ourselves and selling ourselves and proving our worth so that we don't experience any kind of ratings downgrade in some way, shape, or form. Also, it's interesting, I think, that within higher education, oftentimes students and parents who I talk to are deciding about which institution to attend on the basis of return on investment. So education now is labeled and framed as an investment. And as with every investment, you got to think about what is going to be the return on the investment that I'm engaging in. And so we find this, I think, in religious studies and other disciplines in the humanities, that what gets marginalized within a neoliberal framework in which markets define everything are those disciplines that don't have market value, right? And so we've seen a huge dip in religious studies majors, English majors, history majors, people engaging these disciplines, and a huge upsurge in economics, business, these types of things. And we can obviously realize why this would be problematic, right? You're really pushing to the side those types of disciplines that ask fundamental questions about what it means to be human, what it means to be a democratic citizen, and so on and so forth. And so our critique, and we'll flesh this out over the course of this conversation, that we put forward in St. Lazarus to neoliberalism is that it's a variant or a form of economism. And economism was a term that was initially articulated by John Paul II in an encyclical in 1981 to describe those kinds of systems and institutions and ways of life that reduce all of life to economic matters. So this has been clearly applicable toward communism and toward certain forms of Marxism that reduce all of life to market or to economic matters. It hasn't been applied as consistently, however, to capitalism within Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought. And our contention is that communism and Marxism is clearly a form or a variant of economism, but we want to also argue that neoliberalism, insofar as it wants to marketize everything, is also another variant of economism that should be criticized.
Okay, excellent. It'll be really interesting to unpack all of that. So, Peter, you wrote with Matt this book, the title Send Lazarus. And could you explain to us a bit about the significance of the title and what you're trying to indicate by that, and its relationship to the crises of neoliberalism and Catholicism that you both identify?
Sure. Yeah. And like Matt said, Matt, one T Matt, thank you for inviting us to speak and to do this interview. So, Send Lazarus is a phrase that we take from a parable of Jesus, and this comes in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16. So, just briefly, it's the story of a man who's described as so rich that he dresses and dines as if every day was a high holy day or a high holiday. And then there's another man who's actually named in the parable. He's named Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is a man who's so poor that he is lying starving outside the gates of the first man's house. So Jesus continues the story and says that both men die. And Lazarus, he goes to paradise where he sits at the bosom of the biblical patriarch Abraham. And the rich man is sent to Hades. Now, the rich man, he sees Abraham and he talks to him and addresses him and tells him to send Lazarus down to Hades to give the rich man a drink, or at least to go back to the rich man's brothers who are still alive and to tell them that if they keep behaving the way that they're going or that they have been doing, they might end up in Hades as their brother is. Now, Abraham, he refuses the rich man's demands, and in doing so, he consigns him to an eternity of suffering because of how indifferently he treated Lazarus during his lifetime. So we see this parable as a powerful indictment of indifference, especially of the wealthy toward the poor and excluded, or to the comparatively wealthy toward the poor and excluded. And we named the book Send Lazarus after this parable because we believe that in that little phrase, send Lazarus, is kind of baked in an expression of the type of habits or habitus that neoliberalism instills in all people, not just wealthy people, even sometimes the excluded themselves. That is, habits of minds and hearts that are baked into our social structures of indifference toward one another. And so under neoliberalism, Matt and I contend in the book, we're habituated into sacrificing each other and the natural environment for economic gain, even if for each one of us, that gain is only the minimal satisfaction of seeing someone else fare less well than I do. So the rich man's command to send Lazarus, it kind of epitomizes an attitude of callousness or even sadism toward others, especially those who are excluded or deemed excludable. And we see that vision as normative under neoliberalism.
Well, it's a very powerful indictment. And so to first ask Matt and then go to Peter, what are some of the crises of neoliberalism? I mean, given that vision that you've charted out, I mean, what particular issues are central in the way in which neoliberalism tries to replicate itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the crises that we're trying to grapple with is a crisis of framing what Catholic social teaching is and what it says about the economy. And so in the first chapter of St. Lazarus, we actually go into contesting one of the dominant narratives about Catholic social teaching and its relationship to the economy. And this is usually promulgated in the United States and dominant in the United States. And the narrative goes as follows. Basically, there's been a debate in Catholic social teaching in the 19th and 20th century about what the proper economic form is. This all culminated essentially in 1991 with John Paul II's publication of Centesimus Annus, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the fall of communism, in which capitalism is viewed as triumphant. And so the remaining task, according to certain people who've interpreted Centesimus Annus, is to defend capitalism against its detractors. And this would be in the form of, leftist critiques, socialist critiques, certainly communism. And we want to offer an alternative narrative, and we really try to take up the three popes who were in office during the ascendancy of neoliberalism. So that's John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and of course now Pope Francis. And what we want to argue is that actually there are indications that John Paul II and certainly Benedict and Francis were a bit more critical of capitalism and certain variants of capitalism. And what we want to contend is that what we should be concerned about is not so much about defending capitalism against its detractors. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 communist countries left, and those are effectively or functionally state-run forms of capitalism. So communism's not the most primary threat at this point. From an economistic perspective, it seems like the most urgent threat is neoliberalism. And so we want to articulate a narrative about Catholic social teaching that runs from Centesimus Annus up to Caritas in Veritate, which was Benedict XVI's publication after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, to Pope Francis, who actually explicitly takes on neoliberalism, and give a narrative in which this is actually one of the main areas of focus. And people concerned about Catholic social teaching should reject that common narrative and take seriously this alternative narrative, and take seriously the way in which neoliberalism is undermining the Catholic faith in a variety of different ways. I think, Peter, do you want to take up some of the other crises maybe?
Definitely, yeah. And so the reason why we want to reframe this narrative and why we think it's so urgent is because, and this is what we talk about in chapter 3 and following in the book. It's a 5-chapter book. In chapter 3, we talk about 4 social crises that are particularly pressing, and they are crises that have been discussed in Catholic social thought to kind of varying degrees. So we want to systematize that. Now, all of them we see as a form of what we call pathological sacrifice. That is where either groups of people or even ecosystems and the broader earth itself are sacrificed to the market or immolated and destroyed in favor of the growth of the market. And these are the proliferation of slums around the world, which we discuss in terms of the expulsion of people from their homes in rural life. And then often when they arrive in cities, they're expelled in different ways. Then the environmental catastrophes, the multiple environmental catastrophes that are being experienced around the world, climate change being just one of these. It's one that's discussed an awful lot, but it's just one of these. And then the other 2 social crises we kind of group together because they behave similarly are mass incarceration and what we call in this book mass deportation. So it's the treatment of people who are kind of maybe native to a place, who are imprisoned and excluded through the criminal justice system, and then people who are seen as outsiders coming in who are expelled or even detained in various ways. So we see all of these as intersecting with market imperatives, namely certain eggs have to be broken for the market omelet to be made, and also certain people and groups of people who do not, say, fare as well under market transactions or in a market order, or just cannot be dealt with through market orders. A dominant way of dealing with these populations has been either to lock them up or to push them out. So we talk about these things as just, especially they've grown to such a scale, as really unacceptable on a Catholic view, on the view of Catholic social thought.
Let me jump
Okay.
in real quick.
Yeah,
and
go ahead.
related to this is a crisis of indifference to these crises. So that what neoliberalism does by marketizing every dimension of life and human subjectivity itself is it makes us focus constantly on our own self-interest and in our own kind of value within the market. And it makes us oftentimes indifferent to these broader issues of solidarity and social justice. So Pope Francis returns to this point again and again and again. And one of the things that he says repeatedly is that when the stock market plunges, we see this as a broad, widespread social crisis. But when a poor person, elderly person dies from exposure to the cold, it fails to register as a newsworthy event. So we focus so much on market matters that we can be indifferent to mercy matters is the concern here. So it affects all of us, not just people who are deported or incarcerated, but those of us on the sidelines, as it were, who become indifferent to these types of crises.
So Peter, then okay, so given the way in which you and Matt have laid things out, the form of, diagnosing the crises of neoliberalism, what kind of contribution can Catholicism make to providing, an alternative vision of human solidarity and human flourishing?
Sure. So Matt started to point to it with that phrase, mercy matters, which we
Mhm.
know is dear to your heart, Matt
Yeah,
Schmaltz.
that's right.
We uh, we see within Catholicism, and look, this vision of mercy has been unevenly and imperfectly applied across Catholic history and in the Catholic present day. But we see, especially in that tradition of the works of mercy, and there's the idea of the corporal works of mercy that apply to the body and the spiritual works of mercy that apply to the soul in Catholicism that has been there for a long time. And it's based on a variety of biblical texts, especially Matthew chapter 25, Jesus' end time parables, especially the one where he says effectively that people will be judged at the final resurrection based on whether they have fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, and so on. So we found in this very traditional motif of the works of mercy, if we kind of amplify it theologically, which we do in chapter 4 of the book, a way to develop a vision for society that is alternative to the neoliberal vision, where everything would be reduced to market matters. So to take those 4 social crises that we were talking about earlier, slum proliferation can be addressed by a kind of social reimagination of the works of mercy, of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and giving shelter to the homeless. And we do a little bit of creative work with ecological crises by saying that socially applying the work of mercy of visiting the sick can help to heal our ailing planet. And then visiting the prisoner can be reapplied to mass incarceration, not just going and seeing people in prison, but trying to dismantle a societal structure, an economic structure where people have to be thrown in prison en masse in the first place. And finally, welcome the stranger can be applied in similar fashion to the deportation crisis. So we see this idea of mercy, and not so much the idea of mercy as the practice of mercy, which derives from the divine life and imitates the divine life as a way of thinking about the social in a way that can be fruitful and that can be counter to what we lay out as the neoliberal vision of the economic and other orders.
Matt, I first would ask you if you have anything to add to that, but secondly, if you could be specific too about, thinkers, for example, within the Catholic tradition that you and Peter found particularly helpful as you were trying to work through these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really tried to take up actually the popes most singularly. We used a variety of different theologians, Karl Rahner, John Zabrino, others, but we really kind of focused on the popes because we think that the popes do kind of set the markers of what's in bounds and out of bounds oftentimes with respect to Catholic social teaching. And I think that, I don't want to speak for Peter. I think that Pope Francis has been particularly important for us precisely because he's coming from the global South. He's articulating a critique of the dominant economic order from that perspective. And so there's a lot of room for us to kind of flesh out his vision. And one of the things with Pope Francis, in contrast to Benedict XVI, is Pope Francis is not a systematic thinker. Benedict XVI, very systematic, Germanic thinker. Pope Francis is wonderful at throwing out kind of fragments. And so one of the cool things that we worked through over the course of writing this book was gathering together those kind of fragments and trying to articulate a coherent critique of neoliberalism out of those fragments. And so he was really generative for us, both in terms of the critique. He's always talking about the fact that we live under the dominance of a faceless economy, right? An economy that doesn't care about human beings, it cares about profits and efficiency and these types of things. And then he also was really kind of generative in offering an alternative to that to some extent. So one of the things that he talks about consistently, and this is consistent throughout Catholic social teaching, is the need to take seriously the universal destination of goods. The universal destination of goods is a teaching in Catholicism that says God created the earth, creation, so that all people might benefit from its resources. And if we live in a particular social order or global order in which all people are not benefiting from those resources, we need to reorder our politics and our society so that is in fact happening. And so we live in a world now, we know, in which about 26 people possess as much as the bottom 50% of the global population, right? So we have around 7.8-ish billion people in the world, around 8 billion. And we have just under 4 billion people having as much as 26 human beings. And out of those 4 billion, around 2 billion are living in either relative or dire poverty. And so Catholic social teaching, as articulated forcefully by Pope Francis, comes along and says, look, we need to find a way to distribute these resources in a more humane and just manner. And there's basically two ways to do that. You have the voluntary, which is charitable activity, which can redistribute resources, but you also have involuntary, which is the area of political redistribution of wealth, which is distributive justice. And so if we want to take seriously what Catholic social teaching is about, we're actually going to have to push for these forms of redistribution. This is particularly controversial within an American context when if you raise the issue of redistribution of resources, you're labeled a Marxist or a communist, but this is actually a central plank of Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis also talks about the need to preserve the sacred rights, not just human rights, the sacred rights of human beings over against a neoliberal order. And the sacred rights are land, lodging, and labor. And so, he gave us a critique and an alternative vision that was really generative for us ultimately.
I need to ask both of you this question because it's always, really interesting to me when I look at how distinctive Catholicism is in the United States. So as you all mentioned, there is this kind of narrative in certain intellectual circles in the United States, particularly, that Pope John Paul II made his peace with the markets, and market economy is something that promotes human flourishing and so forth. And so you get this very, very strong narrative that particularly the aspects of neoliberalism that you cite as being problematic are actually, wonderful, and that, Catholicism and Catholic social teaching in particular can affirm them and validate them. So thinking in terms of intellectual or theological history, how would you both trace the origins of this alternate narrative that really does, it seems to me, place Catholicism at the service of the market? And Catholic social teaching is something that supports the market. Can either of you or both of you hopefully comment on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of broader trajectories where, I mean, one could look at it in terms of American Catholic history, where
Hmm.
Catholics had to find a way to kind of normalize themselves and show that we're not, kind of wacky soldiers of the Pope here on American soil. So any way that Catholics could normalize themselves, even if that did mean signing on to capitalist projects or practices of war or things like that, would have been seen as attractive by some in the hierarchy and people in the pew. And so we see Americans, American Catholics, that is, kind of habituating themselves to whatever seems emblematic of America. I mean, to the point where we'll have, say, on some altars at our churches, the American flag on one side and the Vatican flag on the other.
Sure.
Something that having either one there is always disturbing to me, but I'm speaking
Me
just for
too.
me.
Yeah.
Okay, so
But especially the American flag for me, I
so
guess.
I think in terms of the broader
Mm,
trajectory, that kind of attempts to normalize is one thing. If we want to get more specific in terms of intellectual history, and we just touched upon this in Sen Lazarus because we didn't want to be too polemical about it. We wanted to be very careful how we articulate this. A lot of the thinkers, especially people like George Weigel or oh shoot, I'm forgetting his name right now.
Michael
The
Novak,
business,
people like
yeah,
that.
Michael Novak.
Novak.
There you go. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, I mean, people like that. I mean, we do have to look at where they are working. I mean, Novak was working for the American Enterprise Institute, which is
Right.
kind of a flagship think tank for what we now call neoliberalism, especially a more neoliberalism on the right. George Weigel has a similar arrangement at a think tank. I mean, most of his books are published through that rather than through presses, and their economic interests, they're expressed through these entities. And look, Novak and Weigel are very intelligent thinkers. They are political movers, and they have a certain agenda, and they pushed that, and especially the fact that Weigel became so close with John Paul II being his biographer. I think this was a way of seemingly aligning the interests of American capitalism and of Catholicism worldwide. Everything that he said, in other words, could be seen as at least gospel adjacent, if not gospel. But
Mhm.
those two are a couple of examples, and there are others. I mean, in within Italy, Rocco Buttiglione, who was is a philosopher and who was very close to John Paul II, but also who is a pretty effective interpreter and disseminator of Friedrich Hayek's work. And Hayek is one of
Okay.
these architects of neoliberalism from the Austrian school. He saw a lot of similarity between John Paul II's thought and Hayek's thought, and kind of found ways to wed the two. So although we focus on the US context in this book, there are other examples elsewhere that we could point to of how this arrangement was made.
Mm.
I would just jump in and say that's exactly right. There are think tanks, there are moneyed interests that are going to put a lot of money into defending a certain form of capitalism or free market behavior, American style. And so there have been many voices that have been supported and ultimately have, I don't think successfully, but have attempted to defend a particular neoliberal vision, but I think it's always on the basis of a very, very partial reading of Catholic social teaching. So I think Benedict XVI is really helpful in that 2009 encyclical that I mentioned earlier, Caritas in Veritate. He follows John Paul II, and he distinguishes between three spheres that must exist in a society in order for it to flourish. And each is governed by its own kind of distinctive logic. One is the economy, and the logic that governs that particular sphere is that of exchange, right? We have exchanges that provide for our basic necessities and material needs. The second is the political realm, and the logic that governs that is justice or distributive justice. The market might very well, as we mentioned earlier, create a bunch of money, but it's not good at actually allocating it in humane and dignified ways. And so the political arm must come in and redistribute some of that wealth. And the third realm is civil societies. That's voluntary organizations, family life, religious affiliations, and so on and so forth. And the logic that governs that, according to Benedict XVI, is the logic of the gift or altruism, or moving beyond our self-interest to enter into solidarity with other human beings. And so you could read Catholic social teaching and say, look, there's a realm in which the economy is important and it needs to function. And so market behavior is really important, right? So George White will come in and say something like that. What they miss, though, is that there's these two other realms that are important as checks and balances over against kind of market behavior. And the concern that we want to signal again is that we think that the economic realm within neoliberalism, driven by market behavior, has colonized these other two realms. And so we've lost this checks and balances ultimately, right? So I think within Catholic social teaching, there's certainly room to defend markets, right? So they're not wrong there, right? But you need these other kind of spaces and logics in order to prevent the market from overtaking everything ultimately.
Okay. So to conclude, let me ask each of you, what are the implications for your argument for ordinary Catholic life and how Catholics should understand what their obligations are, or even more broadly, what it means to be Catholic? I'll ask Peter first.
Sure. The way that we end this book is we talk about how at least we believe, and we were writing this in 2019. I mean, I think it's even more pressing in 2024,
Mm,
that we need a gut check. We're at a kind of point of inflection, a moment of decision where, in kind of good Augustinian fashion, we have to decide, what do we love? Because if we live under neoliberalism, which we argue that we do, and if neoliberalism in a kind of stealth way can habituate us into market behaviors in every sphere of our lives, then we have to ask, where is the space for God and where is the space for neighbor in my life? And if we discover through spiritual discernment that maybe we are more dedicated to our LinkedIn profile or to our investments, or even just to an order around us that tends to be more based on markets than mercy, then we should find a way to live differently. Pope Francis will put it very simply. He says that we have to break our indifference toward other people and toward the earth. We have to be able to hear cries when they are there, and we have to address them when they come. So I do think that dimension of a gut check of what am I really dedicated to is very important. And no matter where people are in the world, they need to kind of hear that call to a gut check. Matt, do you have things to add?
Yeah, I can only echo what you said really powerfully there. I mean, I think if we adopt a functionalist definition of religion, which defines religion by what we give ourselves to, what we devote ourselves to ultimately. So David Foster Wallace gave that famous commencement speech in which he says, we don't have a decision whether or not to worship. It's really a question of what we're going to worship, what we're going to give ourselves to, what we're going to devote ourselves to ultimately. If we adopt that kind of functional lens for thinking about religion, I would make the provocative claim that, at least within the United States, the most pervasive religion is capitalism. More people devote their lives to capitalism and to capital accumulation than anything else. I'd say nationalism is second, and any other kind of traditional religion is a distant third. So I think that what we really need to do is make explicit the ways in which this stealth neoliberalism has kind of burrowed itself into our social lives, into our subjectivity, and be explicit about the ways in which it's in tension with and contrast with Catholic life and Catholic spirituality. And so I think a big point is just making people conscious of what's actually going on and the way in which their hearts are divided between, you know, their explicit religious affiliation and what's actually really kind of animating much of their life in terms of a commitment to neoliberalism. So I think if we can make that explicit, that'd be a really constructive and important thing. And then I also think pointing towards an alternative. You know, neoliberalism is oftentimes talked about in terms of Tina. There is no alternative. Get in line or else you will be left behind, right? Get on board with markets as the sole way of running our lives or else, right? And I think what we have to do is begin to articulate the ways in which we can live life differently. We can organize our life differently with respect to civil society, with respect to political life, and so on and so forth.
Well put. Well, the book's title again is Send Lazarus, Catholicism and the Crises of Neoliberalism. And thank you, Peter Joseph Fritz and Matthew Eggemeier, for sharing your vision and your work. And even though the book was written 5 years ago, it's really addresses important topics. And it's nice that you all have refreshed your memories and were able to present your insights and arguments so forcefully and cogently. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks,
Really
Matt.
appreciate it.
Right.
Thanks.